Our third question is, should external ethics codes apply to the court? Jeff Flake, yes or no?
I think my thing only says no here, so. But I think ethics codes should apply. External ethics codes, no. Remember, this is the independent judiciary. And if Congress as a body decided which ethics code it would impose on the court, and perhaps change them over time depending on which way the court is leaning, that's not a good thing. So the court recognized that due to certain activities, certain members of the court, trips that were taken and whatnot, have undermined, let's face it, the legitimacy of the court or the people's perception of the fairness of the court. And I do think that needed to be addressed, and it has been by the court. Now, some will argue, I'm sure it'll be argued here, that those are not enforceable or just self-enforceable and therefore not enforceable. But I think that there's even greater danger to politicize the court, to put the power in another body, the Congress here, to regulate what the code of ethics ought to be for the court. If you read through the code of ethics that the court has, they say they always had it, they simply needed to make it more explicit, which they have now. It's good. It addresses issues in terms of recusal and gifts and whatnot. It's good. It's just the question of, do we trust the court enough to implement it on its own? And I think that we should.
Thank you. Jamal Greene, you're up next. Should external ethics codes apply to the court, yes or no?
Mine only says yes. Every judge in the United States is bound by a code of ethics. That is, every judge but 9. When we look at what happens in other federal courts, the question of whether an ethics code should apply to the court is less a question of should it apply. Of course it should, and in fact the court has a code of conduct already. The question is who should enforce it, as Senator Flake notes. With other federal judges, the way this gets enforced is it's by fellow judges, and then eventually potentially to the Judicial Conference of the United States. The objection to doing that at the Supreme Court level runs something like this, where the court kind of sits atop the judicial pyramid, and so putting some other body of fellow judges in judgment over ethics complaints against the court's justices puts them somehow on top of the court. The justices themselves seem to entertain some version of this objection. I don't find this very persuasive. Yes, the court is atop the judicial pyramid, but they're not above the law. And just as bribery laws apply to the Supreme Court and are adjudicated by others and can be, so too could a code of ethics be adjudicated by a committee of fellow judges. And if you're worried about whether the court is taken out of the process or something like that, just have them be able to review the decision of the other body, or have them voluntarily submit to its jurisdiction and help restore some of this record low public trust that the court is enjoying at the moment.
Thank you. Cristina Rodríguez, yes or no? Should external ethics codes apply to the court?
So I would start by saying that there already are...
Can you say the word yes?
Yes, yes. I would start by saying that there already are external rules that apply to the court. Congress has passed the Ethics in Government Act, which requires disclosures of gifts. That's part of the reason why some of the justices have gotten in trouble for not disclosing travel that was paid for by their wealthy friends. The federal recusal statute also requires judges to recuse themselves when their judgment could be called into question because of a conflict of interest. Having an ethics code, and one that emanates from Congress, one that's publicly visible, is especially important for an institution like the court because it depends upon the public's confidence for its decisions to have effect. That is the crucial mechanism for ensuring that the Supreme Court's decisions actually become the law of the land. And the perception by the public that judges are the ones who police their own conduct is one that undermines public confidence in the court. I think as Professor Greene suggested, there are ways to have not just these federal laws that apply and the justices decide whether they've abided by the laws, but to also have external bodies provide recommendations for and indicate to the judges whether they have actually, in fact, followed the laws. Justice Kagan herself suggested that a panel of judges could perform that function. And so for the integrity of the court, we should take that into consideration.
Thank you. Should external ethics codes apply to the court? Jeff Sessions, yes or no?
I don't think that's no. I don't think that's necessary. I think a due respect for the independence of the courts should say that they should be trusted to manage their own business, but they are indeed subject to criticism. I think people have every right to, and every right to criticize opinions. I just think we should be careful that we don't suggest that the court members are corrupt and that they are otherwise not performing with the integrity that when they make decisions about cases that have different results than we might adhere to. So I think that leaving the court to set its own standards is good. I think Justice Roberts did well in writing this new 10, 12-page ethics code of conduct that they wrote, responding to criticisms that were placed on the court. All 9 of the justices signed that new standard, new code of conduct, updated. I think that's sufficient for the criticisms that have been out there.
Thank you, Jeff Sessions. All right. So we have 2 yeses and 2 nos. Jeff Flake, you want to jump right in? Please do.
I would just say there is one remedy, and Congress does have some oversight. There is the impeachment power, and justices can be impeached and removed. I think in the history, there's been one impeachment, but not removal, not conviction. But that remedy does exist in exigent circumstances. But I think that we do have a good ethics code now. It is explicit. Everyone has signed it, and I think it's better to keep that within the independent judiciary.
What I think I hear people taking the opposing view argue is the matter of enforcement, and that's the challenge when it's not external and there's no enforcement. What about that?
That is difficult, and that's a valid criticism. However, I think the remedy, the proposed remedy to have Congress then enforce it, puts it back into the political arena. And
does it bother you constitutionally also?
Yes, yeah, and I worry about that. It could come to a point. I would rather, and as Senator Sessions said, the justices are responsive to criticism. That's why they did come forward with this code that was signed by all of them, and I think that's totally proper. But having Congress enforce that brings problems of not just constitutional, but other perception problems as well.
Maybe in the research that you did on the President Biden's commission, is there a constitutional limitation on what kind of ethics rules they can place on the independent judiciary? Has that been discussed or decided?
I think that the way that it's described is that it is an open constitutional question. I think Congress does have the power to enact regulations governing the court. It regulates the court's size, it funds the court, it determines its jurisdiction. As part of its duty to effectuate the Constitution, Congress can enact laws that are necessary and proper to ensuring the integrity of the judiciary, and ethics rules are part of that. I do think that if you had a Congress that was micromanaging the court, constantly bringing people up for hearings, castigating them on a regular basis, and if that started to break down along partisan lines, that would be a problem because it would politicize the court and overly involve Congress in the court's dealings. But I think that creating mechanisms whereby it's not the justices themselves who decide whether they're biased. Of course, they're going to think they're not biased. But where you have some external party, whether it's a panel of judges or somebody else explaining why recusal might be appropriate in certain circumstances, that would help in producing confidence in the court's judgment.
And I quite agree. And when I hear Senator Flake talk about, well, if Congress were enforcing it in some way, and the way in which Congress tends to enforce its oversight is through hearings or press conferences and so forth, I do think that would be present some real separation of powers problems. But every other federal court in the country is subject to a code of conduct, and other judges enforce it. And they sit in committees. They are chosen based on being respected members of the judiciary. So there are ways of doing this that are less politicized and that adhere to the basic reality that these are human beings. And yes, only Justice Chase, I guess, was impeached, but Abe Fortas might have been impeached if he had not resigned. Right. So there are other examples, and we can't assume that the court is some kind of above ordinary human foibles.
So to the two Jeffs, to Jeff Flake and Jeff Sessions, Jamal's making the point that all other federal judges are subject to external ethics codes. Why make an exception for these 9? Is there a rationale for that?
Well, I'm arguing that they are subject. It's just enforced by them.
But the key word in the question is external.
Well, yeah, and I think in this case we have an independent judiciary that should remain so. In this case, have you met members of Congress here? They love to hold hearings. Can you imagine the hearings that you see the nomination hearings are politicized enough. If every time that a justice did something that some member of Congress felt was contrary to the ethics code that was signed or that they enforced, you can see hearings that would be held. I mean, I just can't see that happening in a way that would elevate the role of the court.
The Supreme Court is subject to all the laws of the United States. They can be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors, and I think good behavior gives Congress even greater power to remove a justice if they're not performing goodly. And so I would say they have now explicitly written out, answering almost every question about code of conduct for the Supreme Court justices. They all signed it. I've not heard a lot of criticism of it. And I think the court, at this point, if they don't adhere to it, the Congress has every right to raise Cain about it.
Do we expect them to adhere at this point?
I don't know that it's a question of whether we expect these particular justices. I mean, we can have a debate about the particular conduct of particular justices. I think it's important to take a step back and say whatever you think about what any particular justice is doing, you can't just sort of take it on faith that they're going to police their own behavior. I mean, that's just not the way that we think about ordinary human behavior. And the idea that the only way, the only response is impeachment is a mighty extreme remedy for the kinds of things that, the kinds of ethical lapses that judges do engage in at the lower court level. You can have censure, you can have taking a forced recusal, taking a step back from a merits case. Right? Those are sort of proportionate remedies for potential ethical issues. The idea that it's impeachment or nothing seems rather extreme to me.
Okay, that is a wrap. That is a wrap on our third question.